The empire was vast. Its banners flew from the edge of Europe to the heart of Arabia, and its courts echoed with the languages of conquered peoples. But even as the Ottomans ruled with sword and script, the roots of their power were beginning to shift. What had once been a frontier warrior state, driven by raids, loyalty, and the prize of conquest, was now a civilization burdened by administration, inheritance, and the complexities of empire. After the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the structure he had fortified began to reveal its fractures. His successors inherited a throne dripping with prestige, but not always with the strength of character or intellect to carry its weight. Selim II, his son, was the first Ottoman Sultan to abandon military leadership entirely. Known more for his pleasures than his policies, Selim delegated much of the empire's day-to-day rule to his viziers, particularly the Grand Vizier Sakalu Mehmed Pasha, a brilliant administrator whose legacy extended far beyond his masters. It was under Selim and his successors that the palace, once dominated by the Sultan and his soldiers, increasingly came under the influence of a different kind of power: women. Known by historians as the Sultanate of Women, this period saw the mothers, wives, and concubines of sultans exerting unprecedented control over imperial affairs. This was not feminism, it was survival. With child sultans placed on the throne and powerful viziers making decisions, the harem became a political hub. Women like Kaiksem Sultan and later Turhan Hatta Sultan ruled from behind lattice screens, issuing decrees in their sons' names, manipulating court appointments, and forging alliances that rivaled those of any military commander. But with this shift came instability. Court intrigue intensified. The Janissaries, once the elite military force loyal only to the Sultan, grew corrupt and politicized. They began to act not as defenders of the empire, but as kingmakers. Sultans lived in fear of their own guards, and some were murdered in palace coups orchestrated by those who once swore to protect them. Outside the palace, the provinces stirred. The long peace achieved by Suleiman gave way to endless wars, with Persia in the east, Austria in the west, and the rise of new maritime rivals like Portugal, Spain, and eventually Britain. Ottoman resources were drained not by defeat, but by the weight of constant resistance. Maintaining an empire that stretched across 3 continents meant constant movement of troops, taxes, and grain, and the cracks began to show. The tax system, once tied to conquest and land grants, faltered as expansion slowed. Corruption spread in provincial governments. Local warlords, known as Ayan, began to act independently, taxing peasants harshly, raising their own militias, and sometimes openly defying Istanbul. The once centralized empire began to resemble a collection of competing interests. And yet, even amid decline, the empire retained splendor. The mosques of Istanbul stood tall. Trade flourished through the ports of Alexandria, Salonika, and Basra. Art, music, and literature thrived under the patronage of court elites. Diplomats from Europe still wrote home in awe of the Ottomans' organization and ceremony. But beneath the marble and silk, the machinery was rusting. The empire that had once terrified Christendom was now entangled in its own brilliance. Every sultan faced a paradox: how to preserve the majesty of Suleiman without the bloodshed that had built it. The answer was never simple. Some chose isolation. Others embraced reform. A few attempted war. But none could fully reverse the slow, creeping fragility now embedded in the imperial system. The Ottoman Empire was not yet falling, but it was no longer rising. And for a dynasty built on conquest, standing still was the beginning of decline. His storm was no longer on the horizon. It had arrived. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire, once feared by Europe and revered across the Muslim world, was now being described by foreign observers in quieter, more clinical terms: the sick man of Europe. But this was not a sudden collapse. It was a long, slow erosion, where each failed reform each internal rebellion, and each diplomatic humiliation pulled the once great empire further from its golden age. Ottoman decline wasn't just military, it was structural. For centuries, the system had relied on a balance of conquest and administration. Sultans expanded, and their victories paid for armies, infrastructure, and loyalty. But with expansion halted and territory occasionally lost, the empire had to rely on internal efficiency. And that, by now, was cracking. The Janissaries, once elite soldiers trained in loyalty and discipline, had become a political force and a disruptive one at that. They resisted change, rioted when threatened with reform, and even dictated terms to the sultans they were supposed to serve. Attempts to modernize the army, inspired by European models, were violently suppressed. Sultan Selim III, who dared to create a modern corps known as the Nizam-i-Sedid, was overthrown and murdered in 1807 by a Janissary revolt. Reform, it seemed, would cost blood. Administratively, corruption had become institutional. Local governors collected taxes for themselves. Peasants were overburdened. Infrastructure decayed. The imperial bureaucracy, once dominated by learned scribes and pashas trained in palace schools, was now bloated and increasingly incompetent. Bribes replaced merit. Nepotism weakened the chain of command. And yet, the world around the Ottomans was changing rapidly. The Enlightenment had restructured European political thought. The Industrial Revolution was transforming economies. Nations like Britain, France, and Russia surged ahead in military technology, diplomacy, and global trade. The Ottomans, still rooted in traditions from the 16th century, were unprepared for this new reality. Diplomatically, the empire faced humiliation after humiliation. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 had already signaled a turning point, the first major loss of Ottoman territory in Europe. Further defeats followed. Russia gained Crimea. Austria pushed further into the Balkans, and British and French influence grew in the eastern Mediterranean. Slowly, the empire's borders receded, not just physically but psychologically. Confidence cracked. Identity blurred. But there were those who still believed in rebirth. In the 19th century, a series of sultans attempted aggressive reform. Mahmud II, for instance, destroyed the Janissary corps in 1826 in what became known as the Auspicious Incident. It was a massacre. Thousands were killed, but it opened the door to modernization. Under him and his successors, the Tanzimat era began, a series of sweeping reforms meant to centralize, secularize, and standardize the empire. New schools were opened. The legal system was overhauled. Western-style uniforms and bureaucracies were introduced. Yet these reforms brought their own contradictions. Many Muslims within the empire saw them as a betrayal of Islamic tradition. Non-Muslims, particularly Christians and Jews, were granted new rights, further aggravating internal tensions. And in the provinces, nationalist movements began to stir. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, inspired by European ideas of self-determination, began to demand independence. The empire was being pulled apart from within, just as foreign powers closed in from without. The once unquestioned authority of the Sultan now faced a new rising force: the press, constitutionalists, intellectuals, and revolutionaries. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman state was no longer the hammer of Islam. It was a fragile state, playing politics with European empires, losing land to rebellion and manipulation. But one thing remained: the symbol. The idea of the Ottoman Caliphate, the Islamic Empire, still carried immense weight. And as the empire inched toward its twilight, it was that symbol, more than any territory, that both sustained its identity and made its fall all the more dramatic. The end was not a sudden collapse. It came like a slow breath leaving the body, a fading echo of centuries of dominance, grandeur, and belief in something eternal. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was not merely weak. It was surrounded, splintered, and spiritually exhausted. But even in its dying days, it resisted. It evolved. And in its final convulsions, it reshaped the modern world. The 19th century reforms had failed to reverse the decline, but they had opened the floodgates to new ideas. The press, once heavily censored, began to whisper rebellion. Schools trained not loyal servants of the Sultan, but thinkers, critics, nationalists. And in 1908, a bold, organized movement of military officers and intellectuals rose up, the Young Turks. They demanded constitutional government. They forced the hand of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, a ruler who had mastered control through secret police, pan-Islamic rhetoric, and fear, to restore the suspended parliament and allow elections. The empire now had two souls, the palace and the people. One clung to divine right. The other embraced reform, nationalism, and in some corners, revolution. The Sultan's power was no longer absolute. And worse, the empire's enemies saw their opportunity. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 ripped the heart from Ottoman Europe. The empire lost almost all of its territories in the Balkans, lands it had ruled for centuries, in a matter of months. Muslim refugees poured into Anatolia. Nationalist fires burned hotter. The Ottomans responded not with diplomacy, but with desperation. Then came World War I, and with it, the final unraveling. The Ottoman leadership, now dominated by the young Turk triumvirate, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semel Pasha, made a fateful choice. They sided with the Central Powers, allying with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. They believed this war could be a path to renewed power, a chance to strike against old enemies and reclaim lost lands. Instead, it became a death sentence. The Gallipoli campaign, the Armenian deportations and massacres, the catastrophic Mesopotamian and Palestinian campaigns, all drained the empire's blood, both militarily and morally. By 1918, when the Allies marched into Istanbul, the once mighty capital was a city of ghosts. The Sultan, Mehmed VI, no longer commanded armies or ministers. He was a puppet under foreign occupation. But even then, the story was not over. In the ashes rose a soldier, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. Defying the Sultanist government and the Treaty of Sevres, which aimed to partition Anatolia among European powers in Greece, he led a nationalist movement from the Anatolian heartland. His war of independence was not just against invaders, but against the very legacy of the Ottoman system. He wanted a new Turkey, secular, republican, modern. By 1922, the Sultanate was formally abolished. Mehmed VI fled Istanbul aboard a British warship. A year later, in 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed, not from the opulence of Topkapi Palace, but from Ankara, a dusty Anatolian city reborn as a symbol of defiance. And in 1924, the final blow came. The caliphate, the spiritual heart of Sunni Islam for centuries, was abolished. With it ended more than 600 years of Ottoman rule. The empire was gone, but its shadow remained. Its legal codes, its architecture, its languages, its cuisine, its dreams, all lived on in the lands it once held. In Bosnia's mosques, in Cairo's coffeehouses, in the palaces of Istanbul, in the unresolved questions of the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire remains a ghost empire, buried beneath borders it once erased. It ruled longer than Rome. It bridged continents. It united races, religions, and cultures under one banner, and failed, like all empires, not from a single blow, but from the weight of its own contradictions. The sultans are gone. The Togra is faded, but the story is not forgotten.